el activo más importante que tenía Aspen eran ustedes. Es evidente que este es el activo más grande que tiene Aspen Colombia. Y de eso nos sentimos todos muy, muy orgullosos. Y la verdad es un placer estar en este sitio. Tiene una magia muy especial por lo que significa, y además que Marta sea su directora, pues nos llena de gusto. Hace 4 años nunca hubiéramos soñado que esto ocurriera. Y la verdad, este modelo que llamamos Liderando a Colombia está siendo un éxito. Otra vez, sin planearlo, simplemente porque teníamos un norte, sabíamos las características de lo que queríamos y tuvimos la audacia de ejecutarlo. Hoy en día ya seleccionamos la 10ª cohorte y nos llegó un mensaje de voz de Silvia, que muchos de ustedes conocen porque ha moderado. Silvia, para los que no lo conocen, es una mujer fantástica guatemalteca que fue parte del grupo de moderadores que después la invitamos a moderar y conoció este modelo. Ella había sido parte de Cali, que es el Central American Leadership Initiative, que tienen el modelo tradicional, llamémoslo, de Aspen. Hoy, de verdad muy emotivo, nos dice lo que ha significado liderarlo a Guatemala, porque simplemente, como dice ella, copiaron lo que hacíamos en Colombia. Ya van en la 2ª cohorte, ya hay una en Panamá, que creo que Pepe, uno de nuestros, mi miembro de Junta y uno de nuestros moderadores moderó. Está en Honduras, abren una en Costa Rica y estuvimos hace 2 meses apenas abriendo un liderando en México. Entonces decía yo que él dije no haber hecho planeación estratégica, entre otras porque eso no se nos hubiera ocurrido nunca. O sea que gracias a ustedes esto de verdad está cogiendo una fuerza que nunca jamás soñamos que fuera a coger. Hoy tenemos esta reunión, que no hay que describirla mucho, porque yo creo que se siente la energía y el cariño, el deseo de contribuir y el gusto de encontrarse con sus compañeros y conocer otras cohortes. Ese es uno de los grandes retos que tenemos, que es cómo hacemos para que entre las cohortes se conozca. Y es un reto que la verdad no le tenemos fórmula. Desde el punto de vista nuestro queremos hacer todo el esfuerzo. Y les adelanto una cosa, y los miembros de Junta no oigan porque ellos no saben todavía, ¿sí? Queremos ampliar significativamente la cobertura en Colombia. ¿Por qué? Es un reto enorme, pero pensamos que esto es algo que las personas que pasan por el programa se benefician tanto que debemos hacer el esfuerzo de hacerlo lo más posible. Y para eso Mariana se va a vincular de tiempo completo a Aspen a partir de noviembre. Y los va a estar llamando acá uno de ustedes. Espero que dentro de un año me digan, esta cana se debe a Mariana. Porque queremos que por favor nos ayuden a conformar los siguientes grupos tan buenos como los que hemos tenido. Termino por decir que hoy tenemos, yo creo que una gran fortuna. No muchas personas en Aspen lo han hecho. Es oír a Todd, quien es, además de un entrañable amigo de muchos de nosotros, él ha estado 17 años en Aspen y todas las lecturas que ustedes vieron fueron diseñadas y escogidas por él. Él fue durante muchos años el responsable de los seminarios. Esta mañana tuvimos con algunos de los moderadores una sesión con él y la verdad se nota que él las escogió porque sabía de memoria en qué línea, en qué página estaba cada cosa. Hoy en día, últimamente, además de eso, se ha dedicado a escudriñar la historia de Aspen. Y les confieso una cosa, cuando Felipe me llamó a decirme que si le ayudaba en esta aventura, lo que más me llamó la atención fue las razones por las cuales se creó Aspen. Las oiremos de Todd, porque yo creo que no hay muchas organizaciones en el mundo que puedan decir que esas razones por las cuales crearon Aspen existan hoy y no solo existan, sino son tan válidas y tan necesarias, de golpe más necesarias que lo que habían sido nunca para este mundo tan complejo, polarizado y casi que agresivo en que vivimos nacional e internacionalmente. Entonces, yo sí le doy las gracias a Todd. Antes de que hable, le voy a pedir el favor a Carolina que les dé unas palabras y después espero, Martica, que nos des muchos cócteles allá arriba. Entonces, Carolina, muchas gracias.
Bueno, yo sí preparé mis palabras, pero también vienen del alma. Bueno, bienvenidas, bienvenidos a queridísima constelación de Aspen, Colombia. Quisiera darle una especial bienvenida a las cohortes 6, 7, 8 y 9 y participantes de seminarios que nos acompañan hoy por primera vez. Y a las cohortes 5, 4, 3, 2 y 1. Que siguen volviendo a este espacio que a todos nos da algo muy especial. Me llena de felicidad ver a tantos de ustedes aquí hoy. Gracias por venir, por hacer el esfuerzo, por el trancón, por sacar el tiempo entre sus diferentes ocupaciones, familias y responsabilidades. Sabemos que no es fácil estar acá. Y para nosotros es una verdadera dicha ver cómo crece esta comunidad. Y es precisamente sobre este tema, nuestra comunidad, que venimos pensando y explorando y ensayando alternativas este último año. Ya somos un número importante, 205 fellows provenientes de 9 cohortes, más participantes de nuestro seminario Sócrates, de diferentes regiones, géneros, edades, pensamientos, sentimientos, ocupaciones, profesiones, miradas políticas y las diversidades que nos hemos esforzado por incluir. Y a raíz de todo lo que hemos ensayado, seguimos con la pregunta, ¿una comunidad para qué? Al interior de Aspen, Colombia, nos hemos cuestionado las múltiples formas que esta respuesta podría tener y aunque hemos avanzado, aclarando posibilidades, partimos de una premisa clara. Sabemos que ustedes están tratando de balancear el recurso más valioso de hoy en día, su tiempo. Hemos conversado en algunos grupos focales para entender más a fondo lo que quieren y lo que no quieren. Hemos ensayado formatos de seminarios para entender qué funciona mejor y hemos reflexionado sobre cómo organizarnos y cuál sería el balance ideal entre lo que hagamos como equipo y lo que ustedes lideren como fellows. La realidad es que no es una pregunta fácil, porque sabemos que cada una y cada uno de ustedes quiere, necesita y puede hacer cosas diferentes. Lo que sí sabemos es que el corazón de Aspen es el diálogo, las miradas diversas y esa indescriptible magia como mecanismo para conocernos mejor, para cuestionarnos y confrontarnos y poder co-construir esa Colombia que todas o todos soñamos. El Instituto Aspen se fundó bajo la convicción de que una mejor sociedad necesita líderes más conscientes de sí mismos, más autocríticos y más humanos. Y llegando de Pipe ayer, con la claridad mental de que es mejor abarcar poco para lograr mucho, no puedo evitar hacerles la pregunta, ¿y si hasta en Colombia no hiciera nada? Si como equipo no apoyáramos, no gestionáramos, si la construcción de comunidad quedase 100% en sus manos, ¿qué sería? ¿Qué quisieran? Y a la vez, ¿a qué se podrían comprometer realmente? ¿Qué sería posible teniendo en cuenta las diferentes limitantes? ¿Quiénes quieren liderarla? Bienvenidos.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you all for being here. It's such an honor to have this opportunity to speak with you, and my apologies for doing it in English. Next time, maybe in Spanish, we'll see. But we often ask the question, what is Aspen? But the other question is, why is Aspen? And so my hope in the next 25 minutes or so is to give you a little bit of a sense of what Aspen is and why it is and how it came to be. But Aspen, at its very root, I think, is friendship. And so I'll tell a brief story about friendship. I think it was 3 years ago this week. Pablo and Felipe and I were together in Ronda with Aspen, España, in a seminar. And at the final dinner, Pablo and Felipe stood up and said, in 2026, Todd has already committed to coming and moderating a seminar in Spanish in Colombia. So far I've failed, but one of the things about friendship is that we tolerate each other's frailties. But Aspen is an idea, and you've heard from Pablo how the seeds that were planted here with Aspen, Colombia just a few years ago have grown and flourished. All of you are here because you've been touched by that spirit in one way or another. And so my hope in the time that we have together is to do this, to say a little bit about our founding moment in 1949. This year, we celebrate our 75th anniversary, and since you can all do math, you realize that it's 76 years since 1949, and I'll try to explain that. Secondly, I'll talk a little bit about how the founders of Aspen got to that experience in 1949, and then I will give a very, very short history in 4 chapters, and that's a lot to do in 25 minutes, but my hope is to be reasonably concise, to give you some sense not only of what Aspen is, but why it is, so that you have a better sense of what it is that you're participating in and what you can explain to others. But then my hope is that we'll have time for some questions and answers. The moderators that I was speaking with earlier today may not believe me, but I much prefer to be in conversation as opposed to giving a lecture. And yet, there are some things that are more easily conveyed and digested through the lecture format. So I'll invite you, and I need my material. So I'll invite you to transport yourself back to 1949, before most of us, I think, were born. We've experienced 2 world wars, a Great Depression. What do we do? There were many institutions that were being built or rebuilt. There was a crisis of confidence and consciousness of how we were to proceed after 2 world wars and a Great Depression. But the story really goes back at least a year or 2 before, when there were 3 men sitting in the hotel bar at the Hotel Jerome in Aspen, Colorado. And any story that begins with 3 men in a bar is going to be a good one. They asked themselves this question, what do we do? And I should say that in 1949, Aspen was not a 5-star resort town. It was an almost abandoned silver mining town in the middle of nowhere in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, about 300 meters lower in elevation than Bogota. And as they asked themselves these questions, what do we do? They said, the problem that we face is that we're not talking to each other. And so in 1949, they convened in Aspen a gathering of about 2,000 people. And those of you who have been to Aspen, Colorado sometime recently know that it's still very, very difficult to be there. So this was an audacious invitation to come and spend 3 weeks talking about the problems that we face and revisiting the resources that we have. And they took as their focal point the 200th anniversary of Wolfgang von Goethe. Why Goethe? I have with me some of the original materials from 1949, and they'll be available to you in the Traveling Museum out by Cocktails. Please keep the red wine away from them. But this was the fundraising brochure. By the way, you could buy in at $5. But they said this: Goethe stands high in the world's record of men who contributed mightily to the foundation of our modern ideas of the liberty of the individual, the dignity of man, and the supreme faith in all men to be the masters of themselves, their governments, and their institutions. It is the aim of this gathering to renew our faith in our democratic heritage, to demonstrate its soundness to the world, and to draw new 20th century usefulness from the wisdom of Goethe's works. And so if you had read this brochure or seen the advertisement in the magazine and traveled 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers or half a world away to Aspen, Colorado in 1949, you would have found yourself in the company of about 2,000 other people and a list of world-famous philosophers, theologians, artists, a music program that lasted weeks, and you'd find yourself in the beauty of the Rocky Mountains. They invited Albert Schweitzer, who went on to win the Nobel Prize, to be their keynote speaker. Why Schweitzer? Schweitzer was an expert on Goethe. He was someone who embodied all of the different modes of knowledge. He was a theologian. He was a medical doctor who had abandoned his European privilege to go to equatorial West Africa to found a hospital, not to bring Western medicine, but to combine Western medicine with indigenous practices as a way of serving the people of West Africa. He was a philosopher. He was an ethicist, and he was an extraordinary human being who was held to be a kind of exemplar of the very best of human beings in a world that had seen the very worst of human beings. The second keynote speaker was the philosopher from Madrid, Ortega y Gasset, who gave not just one, but 2 lectures because he was so excited by his visit. And the list goes on. Thornton Wilder, Dr. Rubinstein was there, a cavalcade of philosophers, theologians, and ordinary people like us who were willing to take the time to reflect on the major questions. And so if you had found yourself there, you would have read this in the original program. The difficulty of our time is a difficulty of the human spirit. We have had to abandon the illusion, which some of our ancestors were able to cherish, that our difficulty is primarily political, economic, technological, or educational. The social order has been rearranged, and old evils appear under new names. Literacy has flourished, and taste has been debased. Goods have been produced and distributed in untold quantities, and blown out in untold quantities. Things seem to be bigger, they do not seem to be better. We are at last face to face with the fact that our difficulty is the difficulty of the human spirit. It sounds to me anyway that this could have been written yesterday, except that we don't write this way anymore. There was a clarity of vision that was at once optimistic and realistic. There was a quality of vision that was both hopeful and that recognized that we had work to do if we were going to continue to survive as a species and, as Carolina said, to reimagine, to reinvent what it might look like to live in a good society. How do we do that? They continue, in these circumstances, it is not unreasonable to turn for more light to a man born 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago or 20. If Goethe's particular time had any relevance to our difficulty, it is only that his time bridged the ancient and the modern worlds, enabling him to stand where he stood and comprehend in both. If his place has any relevance, it is only that Germany is the bloody battleground which we all feel, however vaguely, however variously, must be planted again if the difficulty of the human spirit is to be surmounted. They chose Goethe not only because he was a Renaissance man, but because he was German. There was a recognition that the difficulty we face as a difficulty of the human spirit was not from outside of what we call Western civilization, it was from inside. And if the problem was inside, we needed to look squarely at ourselves and each other and to reflect on the traditions that we had inherited, to think critically about the present moment, and then to think creatively about the future that we might occupy together. And so the end of this section of the program reads as follows. It was the sense of the organizers that this inquiry into the life that we were going to lead, while it could be dodged, it could not be postponed. If man is somehow one, and if the world is somehow one, it is not too soon to wonder what it is that unifies both man and the world. World organization will be human community, or it will not be at all. And the great society, fully, even distractedly conscious of its divergences and distinctions, will not become the human community until it finds the common spirit that is man. We try here to undeceive and fortify ourselves. We turn here to Goethe and search him, the better to turn to and search ourselves and cry, more light, more light. We try here to undeceive and fortify ourselves. Where do we go to reflect on the decisions that we have made and the decisions that we have to make? Where do we go to peel away the idols, the ideology, the false conceptions that we may hold in the spirit of skepticism, but also in the spirit of recommitting ourselves to ideas and ideals that we must and do hold dear? And so it's this tension between undeceiving ourselves and committing ourselves to fundamental values like the dignity of the individual, like the possibility of being masters of ourselves and our institutions. Why is that important? The three guys in the bar that I mentioned before were Walter Paepcke, who was the son of a German immigrant who became a CEO. He made cardboard boxes, his company did, and he understood what happened when a democratic country goes off the rails. The second person in the bar was Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was the chancellor of the University of Chicago. And as the chancellor of the University of Chicago, he had overseen the Manhattan Project. So to say that the human community will be one or it will not be at all is actually an existential statement. And so they reflected, along with the third guy, a philosopher from the University of Chicago called Mortimer Adler, who was of Jewish descent, and also understood what happens when a highly intelligent, highly functional country or civilization uses its power to dehumanize rather than to humanize. And their solution, as I said, was to bring people together for 3 weeks in Aspen to have these big conversations. And if you were to be there, you would hear these closing remarks from Robert Hutchins. Hutchins, who gave the final address in 1949, said this: "The common bond is the bond of faith. Goethe's faith in goodness, his faith in humanity, his faith in the goodness of humanity, is the solid ground beneath the feet of those who refuse to be drawn into the morass of cynicism and despair. This faith is a creative force, a force that can make us better than we are and better than we have been. Through this faith, we may bring about this moral, intellectual, and spiritual revolution which will unite mankind in lasting peace. That is wonderfully optimistic and wonderfully realistic. And that is the spirit that launched what then became the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies at the end of 1949. And so we celebrate 75 years later, the first year of programming of the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, this year, 75 years later. For the last 35 years or so, we have ceased to be the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies as the formal title, and we can talk about that in question and answer if you'd like. But that humanistic spirit remains. How do we think about the power that we have? How are we as individuals and as a collective going to use the freedom that we have in ways that uplift the human personality rather than degrading the human personality? And how do we do that in a radically pluralistic environment where we don't necessarily agree about what the good life is for a human being? So you might say, what is Aspen? Aspen is the answer to the question, where do I go to undeceive and fortify myself? And you have a little bit of a sense of why Aspen is, because, as Pablo was saying about this great experiment, Walter Pepke, the founder of the Aspen Institute, said, Aspen is a great experiment of uncertain results. And 75 years later, we continue that experiment, which is an experiment in friendship. So, 2 mini lectures to follow that founding story. The first mini lecture I call 3 cities, 2 characters, 1 Aspen. And the second story is a short history of the Aspen Institute in 4 chapters. 3 cities. The first city is Weimar. The year is 1919. The founding of the Bauhaus, which was an artistic as well as a cultural movement. And the question that the Bauhaus asked was, how do we make sure that the machine serves man and not man the machine? Why were they asking themselves that question? They were trying to rebuild Germany, rebuild Europe after the First World War. And they recognized that industrial society gave us extraordinary technology that at the same time dehumanized us. We become cogs in the machine of the system. So they were asking, how do we take the best of modern technology and recreate a world in which we have the opportunity to uplift the person rather than degrade the person? This was an incredibly countercultural movement, so countercultural that the Nazis shut it down in 1933, which leads us to the second city, which is Chicago. Why Chicago? Many members of the Bauhaus emigrated to the United States, some of them to New York, some of them to Chicago, where they formed the Neubauhaus, in part under the patronage of Walter and Elizabeth Pepke. Herbert Bayer, Kandinsky was in the Bauhaus, Moholy-Nagy. It was an amazing mix of artists, and they brought that spirit to Chicago. How do we make sure that the machine serves man and not man the machine? The other thing that's happening in Chicago at this time is the reforms of Robert Maynard Hutchins, whom I mentioned earlier. Hutchins recognized that if the problems we faced were problems of the human spirit, no one mode of academic knowledge and no one professional certification was adequate to addressing those problems. So we're faced with a bit of a dilemma. modern society thrives on increased specialization, and that specialization of knowledge and the professional sector actually makes it more difficult to address the problems that we need to solve. And so Hutchins was trying to reorganize the Bismarckian disciplines, the siloization in the university, to an integrated approach to thinking about the human condition. And so together, Hutchins and Pepke conceive of this idea of bringing everybody to Aspen as a way of wrestling with the difficulty we face as the difficulty of the human spirit. Which leads me to the third city, which is not Aspen, it's Madrid. Because this is what happens. Ortega y Gasset comes and he gives his talk in Aspen in 1949. And in October of 1949, Walter Pepke writes to him and says, "Wow, that was great. We want you to help us found Aspen University." And Ortega writes back and says, "You do not want to found a university because universities in their present form actually recapitulate the kind of specialization that we're trying to avoid. You want to refound an institute of humanistic studies like what I've done in the last couple of years in Madrid." Ortega goes on to say a couple of other things. He says, yeah, that was really, really great what we did in Aspen. Right? What was really great about it was that it combined the best of Athens and Sparta. We had the life of the mind, of culture, of reason, of dialogue with Athens, and it wasn't too comfortable, just like Sparta. It was Spartan. And he said the problem is that we moderns, and especially people in the United States, are too attached to their objects. And they're too attached to physical comfort. And when you're distracted from reality by all of these technological devices, and when you're too comfortable, you lose sight of what really elevates the human spirit. And he literally says, the worst thing that could happen would be for Aspen to become a 5-star resort. And so we appreciate the irony that 75 years later, it is a 5-star resort. And I mentioned that because one of the things that sometimes gets in our way of describing the Aspen idea and the Aspen Institute is that there's this public resort persona, which in many ways is antithetical to the kind of Spartan life of the mind that lies at the heart of the Aspen conversational experience. But the other thing that Ortega says is that you don't want to found universities,
but you also want to create a space, a physical space where people can come together
and actually engage in conversation. And so fast forward, December of 1949, very beginning of December, Walter Pepke incorporates Aspen University.
And 3 weeks later, they reincorporate as the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies.
That's the second city, we should call it. Third city is Madrid. And especially when I'm with my friends in Aspen, España, I'm very fond of saying, actually, the Aspen Institute was not founded in Aspen, it was founded in Madrid. And so I think we can all take pride in that. And I will say, just as an addendum, from the beginning, as you've already understood, but I will emphasize here, Aspen was not an American experiment. It was not an imperial gesture by the United States. It was international from the very beginning, and it does take its inspiration and its roots, not just from Europeans, but from people all over the world. So that is the 3 cities. Who are the 2 characters? Goethe is famous for his Faust. You can look at the music program out at the museum on the counter, and you'll see that there's a whole music program devoted to Faust themes. Well, who was Faust? Faust was that person who traded his soul for power. That they understood to be the modern character. The pursuit of power at the expense of our humanity, of our soul. Who's the counter character? The counter character is present in the person of Ortega y Gasset, whose first book in the early 1900s was on Cervantes. The other character is Quixote. Who is Quixote? Quixote is the one who gives up power and, presumably foolishly, pursues the ideals. In thinking about these two characters and juxtaposing them, which character are we going to be? Not only as individuals, but also as a culture or a civilization. And of course, Quixote is held to be foolish, even absurd. And again, there's something absurd and foolish about people gathering together to reflect on what does it mean to be a good human being? What does it mean to live in a good society in a world where we can have almost all the power that we want and use it however we want? So we've got three cities, Weimar, Chicago, Madrid. We've got two characters, Faust and Quixote. And so if you've been to seminar, if you're part of some of these cohort discussions, and you go tell your spouse or your friends what it was that you were doing for several days, you were reading what? You were talking about what? That's really stupid. That's foolish. Foolish. And it is. And yet sometimes what is foolish to the world at this moment is actually the voice crying in the wilderness that allows us to think about the kinds of people that we might be or might become. And so that leads us then to one aspen. What do I mean by one aspen? The aspen tree, the aspen grove, is the largest biological organism on the planet, the biologists tell us. Because you see each individual tree, but it's actually connected. The grove is connected by a common taproot. And I think it's a wonderful metaphor for what we try to do at Aspen, which is to say, we're not an ideology, we're not a movement, but we are a set of conversations that allow us to be bound together by our common humanity and yet retain our individuality. And you already know from your cohort experiences that the friendships that emerge that allow you to draw upon the resources through the common root system is one of the most valuable things of the Aspen experience. We can be ourselves and yet be very different from one another. So, the short history of the Aspen Institute, 4 chapters. Chapter 1, from 1950 to about 1970, about all we do in Aspen, US, is seminars. There's a little bit more to the story, but the vision was relatively small groups of people getting together using texts as a way of reflecting on individual and collective responsibility. Chapter 2 has 2 parts to it. One is the recognition that the humanities were important reintroduction into the thinking of our common life that had become dominated by technology. But there was also a recognition that the humanities and the natural sciences and the social sciences needed to be in conversation with one another. So we developed policy programs that look at particular content issues, generate content expertise, and then bring that into the seminar discussions. So that's part 1 of chapter 2. The other part is what I call the outward turn. They say that the vision had always been international, but from around 1971, there's an emphasis really to engage in an international conversation. So much so that in 1971, we give the first Statesman Humanist Award to Jean Monnet, the architect of the European experiment. In 1973, they give the award to Willy Brandt, who comes from Germany to Aspen, and in that speech in Aspen in 1973, announces the plan in 1974 to start Aspen Berlin, now Aspen Germany. So institutionally, this is the first moment, 1974, where there is an independent organization that is linked to the Aspen Institute US, but is independent. And Colombia is now the 13th international partner which is independently founded, independently governed, and independently financed. And we work together in the spirit of friendship, which is to say, particularly as someone from the United States, it's really wonderful to be part of an international network that's not just an expression of the United States imperialism. We have so much to learn from each other, and one of the things I love about working with all of the international Aspens with which I've been privileged to work is the opportunity to learn. And so this is an expression of this idea that starts in 1973. Chapter 3, around about the late 1990s. Sorry? Oh, I'm going to get to that, don't worry. The third Humanistic Award, okay, since we're going to go there now, the third Humanistic Award was given to a former Colombian president. Alberto, yes. And the fourth, we can talk about some other time, was the only one given to someone from the United States. But that gives you a sense that we're not just looking to Europe, we're looking in all directions and also looking to receive from all directions. So the connection between Aspen, US and Colombia goes back a very, very long way. And I'm sure he would be very happy to see all of us sitting here in this room. So chapter 3 is roughly 1999 to 2018, call it. That's the growth of big public programs like the Ideas Festival and other kinds of, I would say, larger events. And so by the time you get to 2018, you have seminar programs, you have policy programs, you have public programs, and you have this network of international partners. Chapter 4, and here is where I'll begin to wrap up, is the chapter that we're still writing. How do we take these ideas and ideals and re-articulate them in a way that is adequate to our present moment? And the fact that all of you are here, the fact that all of you bring different experiences, different perspectives, and we recognize that we could be even more different than we are, the fact that we are here, taking seriously this quixotic adventure, participating in this quixotic experiment, is, I think, a great sign of hope. Let me conclude by reading a passage from Albert Schweitzer's lecture in Aspen. And again, Schweitzer went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1953. But in Aspen, he writes this. And by the way, Schweitzer spoke German and he spoke French. He did not speak English. So we have actual recordings, and actually there's an LP out on in the museum of the German recording of his speech. Thornton Wilder did the simultaneous translation, and I learned today that Thornton Wilder had a very important Colombian connection, which I need to explore. But Schweitzer says this: the supreme manifestation of the Spirit in man is love. The Spirit does not permit man to be satisfied with simply asserting himself and imposing his will on other beings. It compels him to be considerate of them. In this way, the Spirit brings order out of the chaos of human relations. Without kindness, man is not man in the full sense of the word. The man who truly understands himself cannot do otherwise than let himself be guided by love. We live in a world that is dominated by the morass of cynicism and despair. And so much of Aspen is a celebration of this act of love and kindness in a world which treats those things as somehow silly or foolish. But the Aspen Institute is an act of faith in the humanistic tradition. It's also an act of hope in the possibilities of the potential of human beings as individuals and in community. And ultimately, it's an act of love in which we give of ourselves in order to receive from others, to be connected in that network of mutuality, but also to be reoriented towards those transcendent things that make us not only who we are, but who we might become individually and together. Thank you for your patience.
Happy lang. Tapos po, yan na piya. Tapos, imut yan. Dami kiki.